I'll start out with this story, and this is the Obama story. I was interviewing Obama about a year ago, and the interview was going nowhere. Obama was tired, he was a little cranky, or maybe it was just I was annoying him. And so I'm getting nothing out of this interview. So I, out of the blue, say, you ever read Reinhold Niebuhr? And we were talking about nothing related, and he said, yeah, I do. And so I said, well, what does he mean to you? And he proceeded to give a 20-minute summation of the irony of American history in perfect paragraph form. And so, you know, I was really struck by that. The thing that really struck me about that address was it was such a joyous occasion here in Washington, whether you voted for Obama or not. The atmosphere was truly joyous. And yet I thought in that inaugural address there was a wintry spine to it. That it was, we must put away childish things, we've been greedy, times are tough, and there was your Niebuhrian alarm bells were probably going off. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing, and this is really my central tension about Niebuhr and goes to your point about the economy. Niebuhr warns us of a lot of useful things about humility, about tragedy, about sin, about modesty. As Americans, we have a counter-tradition which counsels optimism, daringness, risk-taking, and reconciling the two, staying American in the most optimistic, ebullient sense of that word, while being conscious of Niebuhr, is the central challenge.
He is here. My old pastor, Father Tom Duffy, Monsignor Tom Duffy is here, so I will have proper Niebuhrian humility, I hope, in the presence of these folks. And the thing that I just want to say about Niebuhr, Georgetown is a basketball school. I can say this, and people will know how serious this comparison is. Basically, Reinhold Niebuhr is the Michael Jordan of theology. You may recall when Jordan played basketball, everybody wanted to be like Mike. And it is extraordinary across the political spectrum how everybody wants to be like Riney. And what I have been struck by over the years is how all of God's children claim Reinhold Niebuhr. I'm sort of taking what David said and turning on its head a little bit. The joy of a progressive worldview or a liberal worldview is indeed its hopefulness, its optimism, its sense of human possibility. But the core weakness of that worldview, as Niebuhr always understood, was a lack of awareness of human frailty, the human capacity to sin. And so the notion that you can believe that American power can be used for good and have no illusions about ourselves, about American power, and be fearful that it might be used for ill is, I think, what Niebuhr taught us.
Many of you, I know, are familiar with the broad outlines of Reinhold Niebuhr's life and work. A pastor, teacher, activist, moral theologian, and prolific author, Niebuhr was a towering presence in American intellectual life from the 1930s through the 1960s. To read Niebuhr today is to avail oneself to a prophetic voice, speaking from the past, about the past, but offering truths of enormous relevance to the present. As prophet, Niebuhr warned that what he called our dreams of managing history, dreams born out of a peculiar combination of arrogance, hypocrisy, and self-delusion, posed a large and potentially mortal threat to the United States. Today, we ignore that warning at our peril. Since the end of the Cold War, the management of history has emerged as the all but explicitly stated purpose of American statecraft. In Washington, politicians speak knowingly about history's clearly discerned purpose and about the responsibility of the United States at the zenith of its power to guide history to its intended destination. As a prophet, Niebuhr thought deeply about the dilemmas confronting the United States as a consequence of its emergence as a global superpower. 4 such truths merit particular attention at present. They are the persistent sin of American exceptionalism, the indecipherability of history, the false allure of simple solutions, and finally, the imperative of appreciating the limits of power. One persistent theme of Niebuhr's writings on foreign policy concerns the difficulty that Americans have in seeing themselves as they really are. Perhaps the most significant moral characteristic of a nation, our prophet declared in 1932, is its hypocrisy. Niebuhr did not exempt his own nation from that judgment. The chief distinguishing feature of American hypocrisy lies in the conviction that America's very founding was a providential act, both an expression of divine favor and a summons to serve as God's chosen instrument. The Anglo-American colonists settling these shores, writes Niebuhr, saw it as America's purpose, quote, to make a new beginning in a corrupt world. They believed, quote, that we had been called out by God to create a new humanity. They believed further that this covenant with God marked America as a new Israel. As a chosen people possessing what Niebuhr referred to as a messianic consciousness, Americans came to see themselves as set apart, their motives irreproachable, their actions not to be judged by standards applied to others. Every nation has its own form of spiritual pride, Niebuhr observed in The Irony of American History. Our version is that our nation turned its back upon the vices of Europe and made a new beginning. Indeed, the outcome of World War II, vaulting the United States to the apex of world power, seemed to affirm that the nation enjoyed God's favor and was doing God's work. Such illusions have proven remarkably durable. In describing America's rise to power, Niebuhr did not shrink from using words like hegemony and imperialism. His point is not to tag the United States with responsibility for all the world's evils. Rather, it is to suggest that we do not differ from other great powers as much as we imagine.
Max is an award-winning journalist, author of the book Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Thanks for joining us again.
Good to be with you.
Apparently, one of President Obama's favorite philosophers is Reinhold Niebuhr. Here's a quote from Niebuhr. "We take, and must continue to take, morally hazardous actions to preserve our civilization. We must exercise our power."
Now, Obama isn't the first president to love Niebuhr. It was really the post-World War II generation of Cold Warriors that loved him, because they were gonna crack some skulls in fighting the Soviet Union. You know, I don't think they wanted to do so directly against the Soviet Union, but in Latin America, it had to be done. In Southeast Asia, it had to be done. So Kennedy loved him. George Kennan, Niebuhr was kind of his teacher, and this was the foreign policy mind, the man who really shaped the Democrats' post-World War II agenda during the Cold War. But for someone like Obama, who is identified with liberalism, this is an attractive philosophy, especially during the War on Terror, which he has sort of extended after Bush. Israel's the West's most extreme vision of itself, and the more we become like Israel, the more we should fear for our freedoms, because and fear for our values, because Israel is predicated on the idea of ethnocracy, that a group which came a settler colonial group came and basically displaced an indigenous group and is still engaged in a project of ethnic cleansing. And it has to do so to maintain itself as a Jewish state, because the Jewish state is built on the foundation of a demographic majority. Now that means that if you apply that to the US, which is majority white and Christian, those who really identify with Israel as an ethnocracy are saying we have to maintain ourselves as maintain our white Christian demographic majority. In Europe, the same thing. That's why you see these increasing links between Israel and the far right in Europe and the Islamophobic right in the US. It flows directly from demographic panic. But the scary thing is you see it even in Washington, in the foreign policy establishment, and you hear it in the rhetoric of Barack Obama, who consistently says that Israel lives in a bad neighborhood. He's using the backlash rhetoric of the 70s that led to kind of these action movies like Charles Bronson's Death Wish, where this white guy who's the last holdout of white flight takes on the black criminals in the inner city, and that's Israel. And Obama is embracing that idea of Israel, which is incredibly dangerous, and I don't think he actually understands the implications of what he's saying or wants to.
And over the past half century or so, I think the United States has pursued two main but disconnected objectives in West Asia and North Africa. On the one hand, Americans have sought strategic and economic advantage in the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, and Egypt. And on the other hand, support for the consolidation of the Jewish settler state in Palestine. These two objectives of U.S. policy in the Middle East have consistently taken precedence over the frequently professed American preference for democracy. These objectives are politically contradictory. They also draw their rationales from distinct moral universes. U.S. relations with the Arab countries and Iran have been grounded almost entirely in unsentimental calculations of self-interest. The American relationship with Israel, by contrast, has rested almost entirely on religious and emotional bonds. This disconnect has precluded any grand strategy. The definitive failure of the decades-long American-sponsored peace process between Israelis, Palestinians, and other Arabs adds greatly to the uncertainty. Washington's abandonment of this diplomacy was a boon to Israeli territorial expansion, but a disaster for American influence in the region, including in Israel. Over the years, America protected Israel from international rebuke and punishment. Its stated purpose was the preservation of prospects for a negotiated two-state solution that could bring security and peace to Israelis and Palestinians alike. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, American diplomacy has been running on fumes for a long time. Sadly, barring fundamental changes in Israeli politics, policies, and behavior, the long-standing American strategic objective of achieving acceptance for the State of Israel in order to stabilize the region where British colonialism and Jewish nationalism implanted it is now infeasible. In practice, the United States has abandoned the effort. U.S. policy currently consists of ad hoc actions to fortify Israel against Palestinian resistance and military threats from its neighbors, while shielding it from increasingly adverse international reaction to its worsening deportment. In essence, the United States now has no objective with respect to Israel beyond sheltering it from the need to deal with the unpalatable realities its own behavior have created. The key to regional acknowledgement of Israel as a legitimate part of the Middle East has been the two-state solution. The Camp David Accords laid out a program for Palestinian self-determination and Israeli withdrawal from the territories it had seized and occupied in 1967. Israel's had more than 45 years to trade land for peace, implementing its Camp David commitments and complying with international law. It has consistently demonstrated that it craves land more than peace, international reputation, goodwill, or legitimacy. As a result, Israel remains isolated from its neighbors with no prospect of reversing this. It is now rapidly forfeiting international legitimacy and acceptability. There is nothing the United States can do to cure either situation, despite the adverse consequences of both for American standing in the region and the world. In the 17th century, English settlers in America found inspiration for a theology of ethnic cleansing and racism in the Old Testament. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Jewish settlers in Palestine have invoked the same scripture to craft a parallel theology. The increasingly blatant racism and Islamophobia of Israeli politics, the Kafkaesque tyranny of Israel's checkpoint army in the occupied territories, and Israel's cruel and unusual collective punishment of Gaza have bred hateful resentment of the Jewish state in the region and beyond throughout the entire Muslim world. The United States has affirmed that, regardless of how Israel behaves, we will allow no political distance between ourselves and the Jewish state. In the eyes of the world, there is no such distance. Israel's ill repute corrodes U.S. prestige and credibility, not just in the Middle East, but in the world at large. Israel doesn't seem to care what its neighbors think of it, or the world thinks of it. Despite its geographical location, it prefers to see itself as its neighbors do, a Hebrew-speaking political economic extension of Europe, rather than as part of the Middle East. Nor does Israel appear concerned about the extent to which its policies have undermined America's ability to protect it from concerted international punishment for its actions. The United States and Israel's handful of other international supporters continue to have strong domestic political reasons to stand by it. Yet they are far less likely to be able to hold back the global movement to ostracize Israel than in the case of apartheid South Africa. America may have Israel's back, but on this, no one has America's back. For a considerable time to come, Israel can rely on its U.S.-provided qualitative edge to sustain its military hegemony over others in the region. But as the Crusader states established and sustained by previous Western interventions in the region illustrate, such supremacy, especially when dependent on outside support, is inevitably ephemeral. And those who live exclusively by the sword are more likely than others to perish by it. Meanwhile, as the struggle for Palestinian Arab rights becomes a struggle for human and civil rights within the single sovereignty that Israel has de facto imposed on Palestine, Israel's internal evolution is rapidly alienating Jews of conscience, both there and abroad. Israelis do not have to live in Palestine. They can, and increasingly do, withdraw from it to live in diaspora. Jews outside contemporary Israel are coming to see it less as a sanctuary or guarantor of Jewish security and well-being than as a menace to both. The United States has made an enormous investment in the success of the Jewish state. That is an American commitment of long standing. Yet we have no strategy to cope with the tragic existential challenges that Zionist hubris and overweening territorial ambition have now forged for Israel. The hammerlock the Israeli right has on American discourse about the Middle East ensures that despite the huge U.S. political and economic stake in Israel, Washington will not discuss or develop effective policy options for sustaining the Jewish state over the long run. The outcome is therefore for continuing deterioration in Israel's international moral standing and the concomitant isolation of the United States in the region and around the globe. The bottom line is this. U.S. policies of unconditional support for Israel, opposition to Islamism, and the use of drones to slaughter suspected Islamist militants and their families and friends have created an atmosphere that precludes broad strategic partnerships with major Arab and Muslim countries, though it does not yet preclude limited cooperation for limited purposes. The acceptance of Israel as a legitimate presence in the Middle East cannot now be achieved without basic changes in Israeli attitudes and behavior that are not in the offing. U.S. policies designed, respectively, to pursue strategic partnerships with Arab and Muslim powers and to secure the State of Israel have each separately failed. The Middle East itself is in flux. America's interests in the region now demand fundamental rethinking, not just of U.S. policies, but of the strategic objectives these policies should be designed to achieve. Thank you.